A black teen boards a business-class flight. His quiet confidence and polite demeanor unnoticed by a flight attendant who immediately questions whether he belongs there. Subtle comments and dismissive behavior follow. Her assumptions clear in every interaction. But just 2 minutes later, she's left stunned when a tall, commanding figure emerges from first class, walking straight to the teen's seat. It's his father, a world-renowned CEO and philanthropist whose name is known across industries. The flight attendant's face drains as she realizes her mistake. But by then, the damage is already done. What happens next not only humbles her but leaves the entire cabin in stunned silence. Stay with me. This is a story of assumptions, dignity, and the quiet power of confronting prejudice. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. The airport pulsed with the quiet hum of routine, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the occasional burst of laughter from families huddled near the food court. Passengers filtered through security in long, orderly lines, some moving briskly with purpose, others lingering, their eyes fixed on departure boards. Daniel stood alone by the large glass window overlooking the tarmac. His reflection stared back at him, a tall, slender teenager, dark-skinned, with soft but guarded eyes. His clothes were neat, a white button-up shirt, jeans, and a black backpack that bore the faint logo of an elite private school. He wasn't trying to stand out. In fact, if it were up to him, he would have melted into the crowd entirely. He clutched his ticket tightly, the crinkle of paper muffled beneath his palm. Business class. The significance of those 2 words wasn't lost on Daniel. He could feel it pressing down on him. Not from the weight of the ticket itself but from the unspoken question that had followed him since he was old enough to notice the world around him. Do I belong here? The answer, he had learned, depended entirely on who was asking. A boarding announcement crackled overhead, and Daniel adjusted his backpack, stepping into line. Around him, men in pressed suits and women with designer bags murmured into phones or flipped through travel magazines. No one acknowledged him, but the silence in his vicinity felt deliberate, a bubble that refused to burst. As the line shuffled forward, Daniel spotted the flight attendant stationed at the gate. Lisa. Her uniform was immaculate, her smile bright and polished as she greeted each passenger, scanning their tickets with a flick of her wrist. When Daniel reached the front, that smile faltered. It wasn't obvious, just a brief shift. A flicker across her face, like a light dimming for half a second. Her eyes swept over him, head to toe, as if searching for something out of place. "Ticket, please," she said, the warmth in her voice cooling by a degree. Daniel handed it over without a word. Lisa's eyes narrowed as they landed on the seat number. Business class, 4A. Her brows tugged together. "Are you sure this is yours?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied evenly, pointing at the matching name on his ticket. Lisa hesitated. A quiet, almost imperceptible shake of her head followed as she returned the ticket. "All right," she said, "but stay in your seat. Don't wander into first class." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to respond. He felt the heat rise to his face. But not from shame, from something sharper. He stepped past her, walking toward the plane's entrance. The exchange was brief, barely 30 seconds, but it lingered, like the heavy humidity before a storm. As he entered the plane, Daniel didn't look back, but he could feel Lisa's gaze fixed on his back, tracing his steps as though to make sure he didn't misplace himself along the way. This again, he thought. It wasn't new. The disapproving glance, the clipped tone. It wasn't loud or confrontational. Not the kind of racism that made headlines. It was quieter, more insidious, a low hum that seemed to accompany him everywhere, just below the threshold of sound. By the time Daniel reached his seat and settled in, the cabin around him had begun to fill. Passengers dragged their carry-ons into overhead compartments, the soft thuds of wheels and zippers filling the air. Daniel slid into the wide, plush seat, feeling out of place despite the comfort. From his window, the runway stretched endlessly beneath the clear afternoon sky. Let it go, he told himself. But even as he flipped open the book in his lap, the echo of Lisa's words refused to fade. The plane's engines rumbled to life, low and steady, like distant thunder rolling over the horizon. Daniel shifted in his seat, pulling his backpack closer to his feet. The book in his hands lay open, but the words blurred beneath his gaze. Around him, The quiet rituals of flight unfolded, the soft click of seatbelts, the rustle of newspapers, the delicate chime of announcements. Business travelers in crisp suits powered down their phones reluctantly. A woman in the row ahead adjusted her scarf, the faint scent of perfume drifting back toward him. Lisa moved through the aisle with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her steps light but purposeful. She smiled at passengers, her voice warm as she exchanged pleasantries with an older gentleman seated across the aisle. But when her eyes flicked to Daniel, her expression thinned. "Excuse me," she said, stopping abruptly by his seat. "That water bottle needs to be stowed for takeoff." Daniel glanced down at the small bottle resting on his tray table. "I was just about to." Before he could finish, Lisa reached across him, snatching the bottle with a sharp, practiced motion. "Let me handle it," she said, tucking it into the seat pocket in front of him. Her tone wasn't unkind, but there was something in the gesture, something too swift, too dismissive, that made Daniel's jaw tighten. "Thank you," he muttered, though he wasn't sure why he felt the need to say it. The woman across the aisle, who looked to be in her 70s, shifted in her seat and glanced at Lisa with a soft frown. But she said nothing. Lisa moved on without another word. Daniel settled back, staring at the bottle now peeking out from the seat pocket. It wasn't the action itself that lingered, but the subtle weight behind it, the message that hung, unspoken but understood. He was a guest here, but not a welcomed one. Outside the window, the tarmac glowed under the sun, stretching endlessly beneath the plane. The engines hummed louder as the aircraft prepared for takeoff, and Daniel tried, once again, to focus on his book. It didn't matter, he told himself, but it did. These moments, small, fleeting, stacked like pebbles in his chest. Each one added weight, and after enough time, even pebbles could crush. The flight lifted off the ground smoothly, tilting upward as the city below shrank into a patchwork of streets and buildings. Clouds swallowed the landscape, and soon the plane floated in the soft quiet of the sky. Lisa reappeared 15 minutes later, a tray of drinks balanced carefully in her hands. She moved row by row, offering choices with the same bright smile she wore at the gate. When she reached Daniel, the smile dimmed once more. "Water?" she asked, though it didn't sound like a question. Daniel nodded. She placed the cup on his tray table without meeting his eye. Already turning toward the next passenger, he watched the cup for a long moment. It wasn't the water, it was everything around it. The way she lingered just a little longer when speaking to others. The way her voice softened, almost playful, with the man in the tailored suit 2 rows ahead. The way she offered lemon slices and extra napkins to the woman with the expensive handbag across the aisle but didn't bother to ask Daniel if he needed anything more. These were not the loud cruelties, the ones that history books remembered. The ones that bled and scarred and left echoes in courtrooms. No, this was quieter, more patient. And Daniel had learned long ago that it was often the quiet things that weighed the heaviest. Across the aisle, the older woman caught his eye, offering him a small, knowing smile. "Don't let her get to you," she whispered. Daniel returned the smile politely. But it already had. The rest of the flight passed in pieces, snatches of overheard conversations. The soft glow of screens flickering across dimmed cabins. The mechanical clinking of meal trays. Lisa returned twice more, each time moving briskly, her gaze skimming over Daniel as if to make sure he hadn't wandered somewhere he didn't belong. By the third time, Daniel had stopped noticing the sound of her footsteps altogether. He slipped on his headphones and gazed out the window at the endless expanse of sky. The plane hummed softly as it glided through the air, suspended in the muted stillness of cruising altitude. The sun outside the window cast long shadows across Daniel's tray table, illuminating the untouched cup of water that had grown lukewarm beneath his gaze. He wasn't thirsty. Lisa passed by again, her footsteps light, but Daniel could feel the weight of her presence long after she had moved beyond his row. It was the kind of feeling he knew well, the feeling of being watched, measured, of being silently categorized and placed somewhere he hadn't agreed to. Across the aisle, the older woman glanced over occasionally, the soft lines of her face drawn tight with quiet disapproval. Daniel appreciated her kindness, but he knew she wouldn't say anything. She couldn't, because this wasn't about words. It was about the spaces between them, the silences that stretched too long, the gestures that lingered just enough to be felt but not spoken of. Lisa wasn't hostile. She didn't need to be. Racism rarely announced itself with a shout. Most of the time, it whispered. Daniel shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture as if trying to shake the invisible thread that seemed to tether him to Lisa's gaze. He wasn't a stranger to this game. He had spent years walking the tightrope between being respectable enough and out of place. It didn't matter that his father was Richard Evans. It didn't matter that the family name opened doors in places most people could only imagine. All Lisa saw was a young black boy sitting where, in her mind, he did not belong. The plane drifted forward through the clouds. But Daniel felt anchored to that seat. To that moment. To her glance. It didn't take long for the next moment to come. "Excuse me." Lisa's voice broke the fragile quiet. Daniel turned his head slightly to find her standing there again. This time with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll need to secure that backpack," she said, nodding toward his bag tucked under the seat in front of him. "The aisle needs to stay clear." Daniel glanced down. The bag wasn't in the aisle. It wasn't even sticking out. It sat flush against the seat's base. Exactly where it should have been. Still, he nodded and reached forward, nudging it an inch further back, though there was nowhere left for it to go. Lisa hovered there a moment longer, as if waiting for something, an apology. Perhaps, some acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But Daniel said nothing. The older woman across the aisle set her book down with a gentle but deliberate rustle, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It was already in the right place," she said softly, her voice laced with quiet steel. Lisa's head turned sharply, her professional smile faltering. "I'm just following protocol, ma'am," she replied, but there was an edge to her words, a thin veil of irritation pulled tight over her pride. The older woman held Lisa's gaze for a moment longer before returning to her book without another word. Lisa straightened, smoothing the front of her uniform with one swift motion. Daniel caught the faintest flicker of something in her eyes, embarrassment, perhaps, or resentment. It was hard to tell. She walked away briskly, disappearing toward the front of the cabin. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, but not entirely. There was something exhausting about moments like this, not because they were new, but because they weren't. It wasn't the sharp moments that wore you down. It was the accumulation of them. The way they piled on top of each other, one after the next, until you found yourself carrying them long after the moment had passed. Daniel turned to look out the window, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. The sky stretched endlessly beyond the glass, open and boundless in a way the world beneath it rarely was. He wondered, briefly, if Lisa would have treated him differently had his father been seated beside him. Would she have softened her voice? Offered him extra napkins like she did for the older man in first class? Or would she have simply tightened her smile, pressing her discomfort deeper beneath the surface, where it could fester in silence? Daniel didn't know which possibility troubled him more. He glanced at the older woman again, offering her a small, grateful nod. She returned it with the faintest curve of a smile. Lisa would pass by again. He knew that much. And the line between them, the one neither of them acknowledged but both understood, would remain exactly where it had been all along. Invisible. Immutable. The cabin had settled into the quiet lull that always followed takeoff. Passengers reclined their seats by inches, heads tilted toward the faint glow of their screens, the steady hum of the engines a constant backdrop. Lisa hadn't returned to Daniel's row, but he could feel the aftertaste of her presence lingering in the air. It was always like this. The moments passed, but the feeling stayed. Daniel watched the sky outside the window darken, the sun now dipping low on the horizon. There was a peace out there, somewhere beyond the glass, a calm vastness the world below rarely offered him. He barely noticed Lisa's return until her voice broke through the thin veil of quiet. "Excuse me," she said again, that same smile pinned to her face like an ornament too heavy for its branch. This time, she wasn't alone. A second flight attendant, younger and clearly still new to the job, trailed a step behind her. Lisa's eyes drifted briefly to Daniel's seat, then shifted with careful ease to the woman seated across the aisle, the older one who had spoken up for him. "We're offering dessert options," Lisa said brightly, holding out a tray with delicate ramekins of cheesecake and chocolate mousse. Her voice had softened, almost as if it carried with it the breeze of an apology she couldn't bring herself to voice aloud. The older woman accepted a dessert, but her gaze flicked to Daniel's tray table. Conspicuously bare. Lisa hadn't asked him. The silence between them stretched. Thin but taut. Daniel glanced at the desserts. Then back to Lisa. "I'll take one," he said quietly. Lisa's eyes hesitated on him. Just for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of pause Daniel recognized, the brief, almost imperceptible moment when a person debated whether they would grant you the same courtesy they extended to everyone else. A flicker of reluctance crossed her features. But she masked it with a tight nod. "Of course," she replied, placing a dish on his tray with delicate care, as if performing some act of charity. Daniel met her gaze head-on as she set it down. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but deliberate, each word shaped by the weight of something far older than the two of them. Lisa nodded quickly and moved on. But the new flight attendant lingered for just a breath longer. She watched Daniel with a kind of quiet curiosity and uncertainty in her eyes that Daniel recognized. It wasn't malice. It was something far more familiar. Doubt. The kind that belonged to someone who didn't yet know which side of the line they stood on. The older woman across the aisle waited until Lisa had disappeared down the cabin before she spoke again. Her voice low but pointed. "You handled that well," she said, slicing delicately into her dessert. "Better than I might have." Daniel smiled faintly. "I've had practice." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Only recognition. "That's the thing, isn't it?" she said, shaking her head. "It's always practice." Daniel nodded, his gaze dropping to the dessert he hadn't touched. "It's not about the cheesecake," she continued, as if reading his thoughts. "Or the water bottle. Or the bag under the seat. It's about making sure you know where the line is." Daniel looked at her, curious. "The line?" She set her fork down, folding her hands in her lap as she leaned slightly toward him. "They won't tell you outright," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "But there's always a line. People like her," she nodded toward the front of the cabin where Lisa had vanished, "they draw it. Bit by bit, with smiles and polite words. But make no mistake, it's there." Daniel considered her words carefully. He knew the line she spoke of. It was the line that told him how far he could go without causing discomfort. The line that shifted, depending on how quiet he was, how polite, how small he could make himself in spaces that weren't built with him in mind. It wasn't enough to have the ticket. He had to earn his right to sit in that seat. Over and over. Daniel lifted his fork, but his appetite had long faded. The plane rattled slightly as it crossed a patch of turbulence, the overhead lights flickering once before steadying. He wondered if Lisa thought she was being subtle. She wasn't. But the truth about racism, Daniel had learned, was that it didn't need to scream to be heard. Whispered lines were just as sharp. The older woman watched him for a moment longer, then sighed, her shoulders relaxing as if she had carried the weight of the conversation long enough. "I admire your patience," she said. Daniel smiled softly, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. "I'm not sure it's patience," he replied. "It's just what I know." The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Lisa stood laughing with a passenger in first class, her demeanor light and easy, as if the weight of the exchange had already left her shoulders. "She'll remember you," the woman said quietly. Daniel wasn't sure if that was meant to be a comfort. He wasn't sure if he wanted her to. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling the transition into the quiet hours of the flight. Outside, the last sliver of daylight surrendered to the encroaching night, casting long shadows that flickered faintly against the windowpane. Daniel settled deeper into his seat. But rest did not come easily. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, each vibration a subtle reminder that there were still miles to go before this flight would land. Across the aisle, the older woman had fallen asleep, her book resting lightly on her lap. Daniel envied her ease. For her, this flight was just another routine passage through the sky. For him, it felt more like a balancing act, one misstep away from slipping into something heavier. Something harder to explain. Lisa had not returned to his row since dessert was served. But Daniel could sense her orbit. The occasional glance cast over her shoulder. The way her hands lingered unnecessarily on empty trays. It wasn't outright avoidance, it was something subtler. Something that allowed her to maintain the fragile illusion that nothing had happened. That was how it worked, wasn't it? Racism wasn't always a blow to the face. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to look you in the eye. Daniel knew this game well, the quiet game. It was a game he had been taught to play before he even knew its name. His mother called it grace. His father called it strategy. But Daniel wasn't sure what to call it. All he knew was that silence had become both a shield and a burden. Somewhere near the front of the cabin, soft laughter broke through the quiet. Lisa's voice carried, light and warm as she chatted with a couple seated near first class. Daniel didn't need to see her to picture the scene, the easy exchange. The way she leaned in slightly, her hands folding gently in front of her. She could laugh with them, joke with them, but with him, her words had edges. Daniel shifted, stretching his legs as much as the limited space would allow. The book in his lap remained open but unread. He didn't want to read. He wanted to disappear into the quiet, to let the hum of the plane drown out the weight pressing down on him. But the weight wouldn't lift. Not yet. A low beep from the intercom interrupted the stillness, followed by the captain's voice. Smooth and even. Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit a patch of turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. The cabin stirred as passengers adjusted their positions, seatbelts clicking back into place. Daniel glanced toward the front, where Lisa had begun moving through the aisle, checking to ensure everyone complied. When she reached Daniel's row, she hesitated. Her eyes scanned him briefly, just long enough for him to notice, but not long enough for her to acknowledge it. Seatbelt, she said, her tone clipped. Daniel lifted the belt slowly and fastened it with an audible click. Lisa nodded but didn't move right away. She lingered, smoothing the front of her uniform unnecessarily, her eyes flickering to his backpack once more. You'll want to make sure that bag's pushed all the way under, she added, her voice soft but firm. Daniel glanced down. The bag hadn't moved since the last time she'd pointed it out. It was exactly where it had been for the past hour, tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of him. But Daniel knew better than to argue. Yes, ma'am, he replied, nudging the bag with his foot for good measure. Lisa seemed satisfied, but just barely. She moved on without further comment, disappearing toward the galley. Across the aisle, the older woman stirred. She opened her eyes slowly, adjusting her glasses as she sat up. She's still at it, huh? She murmured, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. Daniel smiled faintly but said nothing. The woman leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. She's trying to remind you of the line, she said, the one she thinks you've crossed by sitting here. Daniel's fingers tightened around the edges of his book. I know, he said softly. The older woman nodded, her expression softening. You know, she said, when I was younger, it wasn't this quiet. It was louder, meaner. She paused, glancing toward the front of the cabin. But this way, it almost feels heavier, doesn't it? Daniel met her gaze, and in that moment, he understood that she wasn't just talking about this flight. She was talking about something older, something passed down, carried like luggage that no one asked to bring. He nodded. Yeah, it does. The plane jolted slightly, the turbulence shaking loose the quiet that had settled between them. The older woman leaned back, folding her hands over her book once more. Let her play her game, she said softly, but you don't have to play along. Daniel considered her words carefully. Perhaps that was the trick. Maybe the quiet game only worked if you agreed to the rules. The turbulence passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than before. The plane drifted through the night sky, a quiet hum pressing against the walls of the cabin. Daniel's seatbelt rested loosely across his lap, but he hadn't bothered to unbuckle it. Across the aisle, the older woman had returned to her book, though she turned the pages less frequently now. Every so often, her eyes flicked toward Daniel, watchful, as if she understood that something unspoken hung between him and the air around him. Lisa reappeared not long after, gliding through the aisle with the careful precision of someone determined to exude calm. She smiled bright and professional as she bent toward a man 2 rows ahead, refilling his wine glass with a quiet laugh that carried just far enough for Daniel to hear. But when she approached his row, the warmth dimmed. Would you like anything else to drink? She asked, her voice flat. Daniel shook his head. No, thank you. Lisa lingered for a beat, the way people sometimes do when they're searching for something to say but can't quite find the right words or the courage to speak them. And then, just as she began to turn away, the older woman across the aisle set her book down with a soft but deliberate thump. You know, the woman said, folding her hands in her lap, I've been watching you tonight. Lisa froze mid-step. her smile tightening as she turned to face the older woman. "I'm sorry?" Lisa replied, though there was no mistaking the shift in her tone, a polite defensiveness. The kind that often hid behind soft words. The woman met her gaze evenly, her expression calm but unflinching. "I said," the older woman repeated, her voice soft but carrying the weight of years. "I've been watching the way you've treated this young man." She nodded toward Daniel without taking her eyes off Lisa. "And I think you've been watching him too." Daniel's heart quickened, but he kept his eyes forward, unsure if he should intervene or let the moment unfold. Lisa straightened, clasping her hands in front of her. "I treat all passengers the same, ma'am," she said, her smile returning, though it felt more fragile now. The older woman tilted her head slightly, considering Lisa's words. "I'm sure you believe that," she replied, "but belief doesn't make it true." A flicker of discomfort crossed Lisa's face. She glanced briefly at Daniel, as if hoping for some silent reassurance that the conversation might end here. But Daniel didn't offer any. Lisa's fingers tightened around the handle of her drink tray. "I'm simply doing my job," Lisa said quietly. The older woman nodded thoughtfully. "Of course, but part of your job, I imagine, is to see the people you're serving. Really see them." For the first time, Lisa's smile slipped, if only for a fraction of a second. Daniel could feel the weight of the exchange pressing down on all of them now, thickening the air like the stillness before a summer storm. Lisa glanced once more at Daniel, this time holding his gaze longer than before. There was something unreadable in her expression, something tangled between apology and resistance. "I appreciate the feedback," Lisa said finally, her voice measured. "I'll take it under consideration." The older woman smiled faintly. "I'm sure you will." And just like that, the conversation ended. Lisa stepped away, disappearing down the aisle with quick, clipped footsteps. The older woman leaned back in her seat, sighing softly as she picked up her book once more. "You didn't have to do that," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman glanced at him over the rim of her glasses. "Maybe not," she replied, "but sometimes people need to hear the truth, even if it makes them uncomfortable." Daniel turned toward the window, his reflection faint against the dark expanse of the sky. "She won't forget this," he said. The woman's lips curled into a slight smile. "Good." Silence settled between them once more, but this time, it felt different, lighter, somehow. Daniel closed his book, letting it rest unopened in his lap. For the first time that night, he felt like he could breathe. The quiet that followed the confrontation felt fragile, as if the cabin itself held its breath. Daniel sensed the shift, subtle but undeniable, like the air just before rainfall. He could feel it beneath his skin, the tension that lingers after truth is spoken aloud. Heavy and unshakable. Lisa had not returned to his row. She hadn't so much as glanced in his direction since the older woman had laid the truth bare between them. And yet, her absence felt louder than her presence had ever been. Daniel watched the empty aisle, his thoughts circling like vultures over the memory of Lisa's expression. There had been no outburst, no raised voice. That wasn't how these things worked. This wasn't the kind of flight where arguments erupted or lines were drawn in the open. No, this was the slow, simmering kind, the kind that left everyone wondering if something had even happened at all. Lisa had retreated, but she hadn't left the game. She was still watching. Daniel could feel it, even if he couldn't prove it. Across the aisle, the older woman turned a page of her book, but the slight tap of her finger against the paper betrayed her restlessness. "She's stewing," the woman said without looking up. Daniel glanced at her. "She'll either come back and pretend none of it happened," the woman continued, "or she'll find a reason to make herself feel right about the whole thing." Daniel exhaled through his nose, the corners of his mouth tightening. "I know." The older woman closed her book and set it gently in her lap. "And what are you going to do when she does?" Daniel hesitated, staring at the window. The stars outside flickered faintly, distant and indifferent to the drama unfolding below. "I'll let her," Daniel said quietly. The older woman raised an eyebrow. "Waiting. I could argue with her," Daniel added. "But what's the point? She's already decided who I am." The woman considered this, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Maybe she has, but I've learned something in my time." Daniel shifted, curious. "Sometimes," the woman said, "it's not about changing someone's mind. It's about reminding them that you see the game they're playing, that you're awake to it." Daniel smiled faintly. But there was no humor behind it. My father says something similar. They can play their game, he says. But never let them think you don't know the rules. The woman's eyes softened. Your father's a wise man. Daniel nodded, but his gaze drifted toward the front of the plane. Lisa reappeared. She didn't look in his direction immediately. She busied herself with the small rituals of the flight, adjusting seatbelts in empty rows, checking overhead compartments that hadn't been opened since takeoff. Her movements were precise, deliberate, but Daniel could feel the inevitability of her approach. It came slowly, like a shadow lengthening with the sun's descent. When she finally reached his row, her eyes barely flicked toward him. How are we doing here? Lisa asked, her voice neutral, almost distant. Daniel met her gaze with the kind of calm his father had taught him, still waters that hid the depth beneath. I'm fine, he said evenly. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought she might leave it at that. But she didn't. Her eyes shifted to his backpack again, the same one she had pointed out twice before. It hadn't moved. You know, Lisa began, her tone light but with a sharp edge just beneath it. I noticed earlier that your bag might still be a little too far out. Daniel glanced down at the bag. Untouched and perfectly positioned, he could feel the older woman's gaze on him. Though she said nothing, Daniel bent forward, nudging the backpack back by an inch, even though it hadn't needed to be moved. There, he said, sitting up straight. Better? Lisa smiled, but there was something hollow in it. Much better. Thank you. She turned and continued down the aisle, her pace brisker than before. Daniel felt the weight of the exchange settle over him like a blanket he hadn't asked for. Across the aisle, the older woman shook her head slowly. She couldn't let it go. No, Daniel said, she couldn't. The older woman tapped her book lightly against her lap, her expression thoughtful. But she knows you saw her do it. Daniel's eyes followed Lisa as she disappeared toward the galley. That's enough for now, he said. The older woman nodded, as if understanding that in some battles, the only victory was refusing to yield. The cabin had grown dim, save for the soft glow of reading lights and the occasional flicker of screens playing muted films. The hum of the engines was steady now, no longer a reminder of altitude but of inevitability. The plane was beginning its descent. Daniel sat upright, his seatbelt snug across his lap. His book remained closed on the tray table, untouched for the past hour. Across the aisle, the older woman had resumed reading, but she wasn't turning the pages. Her gaze lingered somewhere just beyond the edge of the paper, as if listening for something unspoken. Lisa hadn't returned to his row since the final exchange about the backpack. There was a strange comfort in her absence, but also a lingering unease, like the pause before a final note in a song that hasn't quite resolved. Daniel wasn't naive. He knew what this was. It wasn't over. Racism didn't end with a glance or a stray remark. It endured, tucked neatly into polite smiles and careful gestures. It lingered like smoke, long after the fire had been extinguished. He could feel the quiet calculation in Lisa's retreat, the way she withdrew just far enough to convince herself that she had done nothing wrong. And perhaps, in her mind, she hadn't. That was the thing about people like Lisa. They rarely believed they were part of the problem. Daniel's father once told him that the most dangerous form of prejudice wasn't the kind that announced itself with slurs and violence. It was the soft kind, the kind that smiled while holding the door shut. She'll talk herself out of it by the time we land, the older woman said softly, breaking the silence. She didn't look up from her book. Daniel smirked faintly. I know. She'll tell herself you misread her, that you were being sensitive. Daniel nodded. I know. And she'll convince herself that next time, she'll handle it better, but next time, it'll just be someone else. Daniel exhaled slowly. I know. The woman finally looked over at him, closing her book gently. Her eyes, soft and lined with years, held something between sympathy and understanding. But she won't forget you, she added. Daniel's gaze drifted toward the front of the cabin, where Lisa's silhouette hovered near the galley. She was speaking with another flight attendant, her voice low but animated, as if rehearsing something. I'm not sure that's a good thing, Daniel said. The woman chuckled softly, folding her hands in her lap. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's enough to be remembered. The plane dipped slightly, and the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please return to your seats and ensure all belongings are properly stowed. Daniel adjusted his seat, watching as passengers stirred from their half-sleep, stretching limbs and rubbing tired eyes. The stillness of the cabin was beginning to break apart, like ice melting under the weight of morning. Lisa returned to the aisle. Her movements were quick, efficient, checking seat belts, straightening tray tables, but when she reached Daniel's row, she hesitated just long enough for him to notice. Her eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time since takeoff, she really looked at him. Not past him, not through him, at him. For a brief moment, Daniel thought she might say something, an apology, perhaps, or some half-hearted attempt to smooth over the edges of the night. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded curtly, her hands tightening around the edge of the seat as she passed by. Daniel felt the weight of it, the apology that never arrived, the silence that stretched in its place. And yet, he didn't feel anger. Not anymore. There was something sobering about it. Something that reminded him why his father's words mattered. They can play their game, but never let them think you don't know the rules. The plane descended through the clouds, and the city lights stretched out below like a vast, glowing web. The world was waiting, as it always did, indifferent to the small dramas that unfolded miles above it. As the wheels touched down, Daniel felt the quiet hum of impact, the familiar jolt that signaled return. Lisa's voice came over the intercom, thanking passengers for flying and wishing them safe travels. Her tone was polished, the same as it had been at the beginning of the flight. But when Daniel stood to collect his bag, he caught her eye once more. And this time, she didn't look away. He wasn't sure what she saw in him at that moment, whether it was discomfort, regret, or something she couldn't quite place. But Daniel saw her clearly. And for him, that was enough.